Thanks, Matt, and hello everyone. So as Matt already pointed out, the talk from my presentation today is on integrated source protection plans and how they are hopefully a win-win for rural water. So firstly, I'm conscious that there's a lot of schemes in the room today hearing the word ISPPs for the very first time. So what is an integrated source protection plan? So firstly, they are an essential component to group water schemes accurately risk assessing their source catchment. An ISPP report is the water supplier's first step in completing a drinking water safety plan. As Donal already teed up nicely, it is under the regulations for group water schemes and all water suppliers to have this completed. Their objective is to identify potential hazards that would exist in a group scheme catchment. Now, we are aware there are a lot of group scheme catchments out there that may not necessarily have these potential risks and hazards that exist. And in that case, the ISPP's report's intention would be to put safeguarding measures in place to help keep the good status and the protect status of the catchment at place and to not let it deteriorate. The process is involved with a consultant being appointed, and it's done in conjunction with ourselves, organising that on behalf of the scheme to complete the ISPP report. So generally they'd be done on a regional basis, so we would try and group as many group water schemes together as cohesive as possible to try and keep the cost as effective and as affordable as possible for schemes. It's important to note that by improving our understanding of our raw water and our catchment, it can better inform us and identify if our treatment system is working as effectively as possible. So there's no use in group schemes having the same treatment process and the same pump house inside as their neighbours, because every catchment is different, every raw water quality and source is different. So it's important that schemes have tailor-made pump houses that suit their needs. And it may be the case, as we have seen in some of the ISPPs that have been done to date, that there are group water schemes that have made cost savings towards efficiencies in their in-house pump house systems. So just not to hammer home too much, Donal teed it up nicely, but this is governed by technical guidance information, so it's not just done, on a whim and a prayer. There is advice there informing us. As Donal mentioned, the Department of Housing did launch a document there in July 2024 on drinking water source protection technical guidance. And the benefit to us in that regard is that it does provide a national framework to drinking water source protection, and it sets out broad steps for water supplies to follow when preparing a drinking water source protection plan, which, as you mentioned, is part of an ISPP report. It does reference our own framework for drinking water source protection, which we launched there in 2019, and hopefully group schemes are mainly familiar with it. It is on our website, and we would encourage every scheme to be familiar with both documents, because it is the intention that every scheme will have an ISPP report completed. So the more background information that schemes are familiar with, the more benefit it will be. So just to kind of go back to the start, I suppose, and where the source protection plans for schemes started. So the NFGWS's Phase 1 source catchment delineation looked at zonal contribution reports. So every scheme in the room here today and every scheme nationally would have this very basic high-level report completed. It was a 5-year programme that the Federation launched back in 2013. And like I said, it was the first time there was a catchment report mapped for each scheme. There were some schemes that had reports older than this if they were part of the EPA groundwater monitoring programme, but generally speaking, it fully kicked off in 2013. And it was the first step required for a drinking water supplier to identify high-level risks in their catchment. So you'll just note here, the very first graphic there delineates a group scheme in Carlow. It's their kind of zone of contribution, and it's overlaid by groundwater vulnerability. So now moving into the ISPP side of things, the bottom map is a new kind of piece of information that schemes will have access to, and it helps schemes very accurately hazard map their catchment. So it would have been touched on in this morning's session, where schemes, it's up to them and it's in their interest to know what pressures exist. So whether it's forestry, in this case here, you can see it's actually industry. It's in the form of a quarry, it's a limestone catchment. Also might be large amounts of agriculture. So by seeing where the different pressures are in your catchment and overlaying that with the type of vulnerability that exists, it's a very basic first level step towards schemes understanding their catchment. And I know a question earlier was that the group scheme's catchment doesn't actually encompass where their consumers are. So you might have a catchment filled with people with their own private wells, and they don't know they're as part of a group scheme catchment. By doing this, by familiarising yourself with who the individuals are that can have an impact on your source, will be imperative to every group water scheme. As part of the Phase 1 reports, it was identified that there was huge gaps on both surface water and groundwater supplies in terms of raw water monitoring data. So since then, there has been massive work done, and we'll touch on that later in terms of schemes really making strides and improvement in this area. As well, the multi-annual rural water programme in 2019 to 2021, it saw the first introduction of a dedicated measure for group schemes access and funding for source protection measures at 100% grant aid. So by doing this, it really helps schemes, say, groundwater supplies put improved wellhead protection in place. They might have had, good enough seal lid on it or putting fencing. So it was a really good avenue for schemes getting very basic source protection measures in place that were very much needed. So moving into the Phase 2 side of things now, which is these ISPP reports. So the illustration there, look, it just kind of goes through more broadly the different headings and areas as part of an ISPP report, but it's available in both of the reference documents I already mentioned there. To date, the Federation has coordinated ISPP reports on 22 group water schemes nationally, and this was done across 2 pilot projects. Now, as part of the current upcoming programme, we've soft funding group water schemes through local authorities have soft funding for 84 ISPPs nationally. Now, it is the intention in time that every group scheme in the country will have these reports completed, but similar to the Phase 1 report, it's going to be done on a phase basis. It is worth noting that there are schemes in the room today and schemes more broadly that are investing in doing these reports themselves. There are some schemes that would have finances there to be able to self-fund this. They would have a healthy amount of raw water data available to them as well. So they really see no sense in waiting for state funding to become available. So in those situations, we would be helping them procure the services of a consultant, and any scheme out there that would like to know more about certain costings and that they think they might be able to self-fund, please do let us know, because we'd be eager to work with you on that. The ISPP reports do give group schemes access to additional pieces of information that they wouldn't have had previously in the zone of contribution report. So there's a broad list of this, but just to briefly touch on some of the new introductions which are helpful to schemes are the establishment of inner protection zones. So the map here is of a group water scheme in Limerick, and you can see the red boundary identifies the zone of contribution report that was previously there. You'll then see the inner protection zone, which is denoted there by SI zone. So in this case of this group water scheme, their source is very susceptible to microbial contamination through human influences. So by the consultant identifying this inner protection zone, it helped the scheme know exactly which kind of pockets of land were most susceptible to that, and it was an additional piece of information that scheme could work on when they're doing their hazard mapping and engaging with stakeholders in the catchment. We also have the introduction of pollution impact potential maps, PIP maps, which are of huge benefit as well. The catchment sizes, so a lot of group schemes would have had their zone of contribution report done 10 years ago, in some cases even longer. And at that time, a group scheme now may have expanded dramatically since then, so therefore the actual catchment has grown in size. So the amount of land that they need to pull water for their source has increased. And similarly, 10 years ago, a group scheme could have had very high levels of unaccounted for water, and really they're abstracting too much water than they actually needed. And so we've seen situations where the catchment has actually decreased as well. So this is worth noting. An ISPP, it does represent the first living source protection document for group water schemes. So we really don't want these reports being paid for, sitting on a shelf and gathering dust for a number of years. So we're going to go through a few examples of group schemes that are actually using these as a living document, putting measures into place and reviewing them constantly. Really getting good value for money for what the report is offering. So it's just to mention now about the importance of raw water quality data. So a lot of schemes have made huge strides in this area. The more raw water data a consultant has before taking on the report, the better, okay? So there are schemes out there that would have financial reserves and they can spend money on putting in really good, comprehensive sampling plans on a weekly, monthly basis. And that's excellent to see. The illustration here is of Dewish Group Water Scheme. They got a lot of mention already earlier, so to keep them humble. But they did put in place a raw water sampling plan in conjunction with ourselves that they have been impacting for the last 2 years. And it's actually an example of a scheme that's going ahead and self-funding their own ISPP report because they have that robust quality data there. There's a lot of group water schemes that aren't at that size, don't have that much finances available, talking about Tipperary, Laois, Kilkenny, Cork, and there are schemes there that still do twice yearly raw water samples. Yes, it's not as amazing as weekly, but it's what those schemes can afford, and any amount of raw water data is better than nothing. So it's no point sitting here thinking, oh, it's all well and good for the big schemes to do that. Every scheme has a budget that we could work with on getting some data in place. The report will be a lot more meaningful with the more data that the scheme have available to them. And we're more than happy to help assist schemes in procuring the lab to carry it out and putting together a sampling plan that would suit the size of every scheme. So the consultant, when they get appointed, will do this desk-based exercise first. They'll look at the data available to them, and then they'll go out into the catchment to carry out further catchment characterisation. Okay, so where they actually get on the ground and actually, put boots on the ground. So it is a case where further catchment characterisation is needed, because obviously the reports were done a number of years ago. Things have changed within the catchment naturally enough. And in some of the 22 reports that have been done to date, by the consultant being out on the ground, they have identified that there's been different influencing karst features, streams, that are actually impacting the group scheme source that they weren't aware of when the original report was done. So obviously extensive catchment sampling is required to verify and approve this, not just source sampling, catchment sampling. The illustration here of the PIP map is obviously of a group water scheme in Kilkenny, Clement to Killishulan, that had an ISPP report done there a few years ago. And it's hard to see there, but the different black text there, it just outlines that there's 6 different group water schemes in that area. So once you might think, oh, I have a scheme close by, but actually in the complex catchments like this, and Roscommon is another good example, there's overlapping group water scheme catchments. So it's important schemes are working together, because you might have landowners in a neighbouring scheme's catchment that actually is impacting your own source water. And the introduction of these reports and maps really help schemes, become more aware of that. But again, none of this is possible without, talking with the committees, neighbouring you, talking with neighbouring landowners, and having full stakeholder engagement throughout the process. An example then of a group water scheme, Athlone in County Monaghan, they had a report done, and every single mitigation measure that was identified, the scheme put in place. So the scheme bought into the process, the board were fully supportive, the staff were fully supportive, and they would have engaged with the consultant throughout. So we would really encourage schemes to do that, because there's no point in a consultant going out and listing mitigation measures if you feel that wouldn't work or that's not practical to our situation. So in this situation, they put in targeted fencing, just to kind of keep cattle away from watercourses. Buffer strips and riparian corridors were also put in place. And because they had such good stakeholder involvement with the landowners, they actually relocated some cattle drinkers, because there was no point, they felt, in putting in these barriers and still the cattle, potentially posing a risk by coming up close to it. So the landowners worked well with the scheme in that, and they were able to reallocate some of the cattle drinkers as well. The scheme had robust raw water sampling data before the ISPP, and have continued doing that even since, because there's no point getting the report and then stopping everything, because there's no way of knowing then if the mitigation measures we put in place are continuing to work. Stranuden Group Water Scheme is a prime example of a scheme that's done just that. Now, I know Ross from the scheme is going to be talking in the afternoon, but it's just to note, you'll see they have a very, very, very complicated catchment there. That they have their lake catchment and they have multiple sub-catchments within that. They were constantly doing raw water sampling on the catchment, not just the sources. And they were able to work out that there was 8 tributaries that fed into one of their most vulnerable sub-catchments. The thing to note there is, that can sound very overwhelming. How would you put in mitigation measures here, confidently? It's massive, there's so much water courses flowing through it. But by doing the sampling, they worked out that one of these 8 tributaries was responsible for 60% of the phosphate loading level. So phosphate was one of their contaminants of concern. So by doing this, they were able to put in the right measures at the right place. They didn't fence off every single watercourse in the catchment. They were able to fence off that particular one that was contributing to the most of their contamination. So it's just a good example, there's a lot of schemes here that have catchments way more simpler than this. So if it can be done, is the point to make. It's not too overwhelming, we hope. And then it's just to mention, ICPs, they are cohesive and they do have multiple co-benefits to different aspects of group water schemes. So at the minute we are in the final stages of a 3-year biodiversity enhancement and climate action plan. 36 group water schemes nationally from different counties of different sizes and shapes took part of this. And the mitigation options that we can see in the ICPs do have benefits from a climate action and a biodiversity perspective. For example, if you can improve efficiencies in your treatment plant as a result of an ICP, this in turn will save money, which in turn has carbon and climate action benefits. Equally, if you are improving water quality in your catchment, of course, this is also going to improve biodiversity as well for the wider catchment scheme. So hopefully, look, they are a win-win, and we do firmly believe that as an organisation. By a scheme completing an ISPP, it helps you comply with the legislation, so that's imperative for every group scheme here. They identify how the source water improvements could be made, because obviously the cleaner your source, the less contaminated it is, the cheaper it is to treat that water, and the safer it is for it to go to the end of consumer. Okay, so if you're abstracting cleaner water, you're not going to be as concerned of it being as contaminated further down the line. Improving the source water can reduce chemical dosing and treatment costs, as we already mentioned. And as Donal already mentioned as well, like Ireland as a whole, we are obliged by EU regulations and the Water Framework Directive. We do have a lot of good quality surface waters out there, but there are group schemes catchments that are affected by poor or deteriorating water quality statuses. So by schemes engaging in the process and putting in protective measures to keep our water quality improving or as good status as possible, it does help us as a country achieve our Water Framework Directive goals. Stakeholder engagement is imperative throughout. Like none of the schemes that put in the fencing or the buffer strips would have been able to do so without the landowner's consent and permission, without the committee's buy-in, without the staff believing in the process itself. This is a new concept for a lot of schemes. There are 22 schemes that have this done, that understand the process and are very well versed, but we're also aware there's a lot of schemes maybe hearing about this for the first time today. So we are developing multiple tiered training courses from a very basic level for group scheme boards to fully get to grips with the phase 1 reports, and then an intermediate and an advanced one as the process goes on. So we will be delivering them on a national basis in time to schemes. Just then, thank you.